Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm Peter Lavelle. I'm also, of course, joined by George Szamuely, co-founder of the Gaggle. We have a wonderful guest today. We have Professor of Politics at the University of Rhode Island's Nicolai Petro. And Nicolai, you wrote a fascinating piece for the National Interest article titled Joe Biden and the Challenge of Ukraine. And I'm going to read the first, not this, the subtitle, but I want to read the first paragraph because I think your first paragraph really sets it up in a kind of an intriguing way. If anything, it makes you want to read the rest of the article. For the first time since the ouster of President Viktor Yanukovych and the banning of his once dominant parties of the Party of Regions, multiple surveys show that his successor, the pro-Russian opposition platform for life, has become the most popular political party in Ukraine, overtaking both President Zelensky's servant of the people, the former President Petro Poroshenko's party, European Solidarity. So after everything that's been done, we can go back to the Orange Revolution, we can go to the events of 2014, we have Victoria Nuland's famous F the EU, and countless of billions of dollars pumped into Ukraine, and the most popular political party is a pro-Russian party. So, Nicolai, how did we get there?
I think a lot of the blame for this has to be put at the feet of Western policy toward Ukraine, led by the United States. In other words, the United States takes the lead in trying to shape this Western policy. And its main problem is that it is not a policy about Ukraine. It's a policy about Russia. And Ukraine just suffers through it. And it was only a matter of time, I believe, until the people subjected to this policy, namely the Ukrainians, were bound to ask themselves, what's going on here? And is this policy really in our interests? Namely, the attitude taken by the previous regime and the current the current president, both presidencies since 2014, has been to very obviously subordinate what they're doing to Western recommendations, oversight, and some would argue even acting at the direct behest of Western governments in ways that are clearly not in the interests of Ukraine itself.
Well, so what you're saying, all added up, is that there is the real perception and belief that Ukraine's sovereignty is compromised with its relationship with Western countries, particularly the United States.
Right. Not having a relationship, not certainly, that would not be a problem, not having a good relationship, but essentially putting all of your eggs into one basket, which, as any political scientist knows, severely limits your options. You're simply beholden to the party that supports you and provides what you need, and you are at their mercy in terms of providing what they need. An interesting example I was reading this morning, what's happening with the vaccine in Ukraine. It is, I mean, I understand American networks are looking at the United States and talking about chaos, but they don't know chaos. You have to look at Ukraine to see what's happening, because 1 month purchases are coming, the next month they're not coming. It looks like Ukraine has signed a deal ostensibly with the World Health Organization. Then it's revealed there is no such deal, there is no guarantee. Then they say they've signed a deal with a Chinese corporation, but that's been rescinded and the Chinese don't know about it. Now, the latest twist is that they have hired a British agency called Crown Agents, which is a colonial company, a company from colonial times, to be their intermediary and distributor, of course, for a fee. And again, it's we have a contract, but no in Ukraine, but no vaccines. And the reason they had to do this was that the Minister of Health, they went to a third party, was that the Minister of Health finally acknowledged that without some sort of intermediary, all the previous promises that they have made were essentially lies, because he admitted apparently in closed session, which has since been leaked by the participants at this parliamentary session, that without this, there would be no vaccines at all in Ukraine through the end of this year.
But right next door, their neighbor, Russia, has a vaccine that was ready to provide to the Ukrainian government, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And the process, of course, would still have to go through registration. What's interesting about that offer is that Russia was offering to transfer, if I believe this is correct, transfer the technology to a Kharkov factory, Lekhim, which would have then been able to produce internationally. In other words, provide the vaccine within Ukraine, and then in addition, provide it to other countries as well. And this would, of course, be very attractive for Ukraine. But the foreign minister has rejected it, adding that even if this were proved to be an effective vaccine, he would vote against using it for Ukrainians. And I suppose the logic here is almost a reversal of what we had in the or maybe the same in the 1950s. Better dead than red, rather than the reversal.
Well, there's some things that never seem to change. Okay, go ahead, George, jump in.
Well, that's very interesting what you said here about the vaccine, because you mentioned in your article that the G7 ministers are intervening in internal Ukraine affairs to at least as much of an extent as Joe Biden was when he was the Obama administration's point man on Ukraine. So that's why I found it a little surprising when at another point in your article, you appear to be suggesting that Biden will adopt a very sensible, rational policy toward Ukraine, something that would be a major reversal of US policy toward Ukraine, which has been up until now to try to pit Ukraine and Russia against one another, because the more these brother nations fight, the better it is for the United States. So that's why I was a little surprised why you thought Biden would adopt an apparently sensible policy.
Well,
I
just interpretation of that, you're saying that Biden should.
I don't think you said should. I think you said likely. I think
yes, I believe that. Well, there's a few things I would clarify. First of all, I made reference to Biden's speech, I believe in 2015 before the Ukrainian parliament. And in that speech, he actually enunciated policies that I described as sensible ones, including what was at the time seen as a very controversial reference to federalism.
Right.
Citing the United States as a good model for the Ukraine to follow. But I would say I would agree with you that what Biden himself subsequently engaged in, and the recommendations that he gave privately to Petro Poroshenko, which we have because of the leaked tapes from the president's office, did not correspond to his own advice.
Right.
So there is that level of inconsistency. If he were, or if the current administration were to revert to that would, to the original outline of the type of policies that Biden was recommending for Ukraine, that would be a good thing. The question, the second part of your question has to deal with what I think is going to happen in the future, I would divide this administration, as all new incoming administration, into two parts or more, but at least for now, there's always a transition period. And then there's the actual policy that is enunciated after the transition is complete. So what we will see for the next 6 to 12 months, probably shorter, probably on the shorter end, because Biden seems to be simply tapping into the shadow Democratic government, the remnants of the Obama administration that are all around Washington still, and simply just shifting them back into positions of responsibility. So the transition to that should be a little bit easier. But this transition takes time. At the very least, there will be in the State Department, I know, a review, an interagency review of all the things that need to be changed from the last administration. And that just meeting will take 6 months. And then coming up with prescriptions will take another 6 months. In the meantime, there will be very few clear policy directives and no agenda specifically for Ukraine. I don't expect the final agenda toward Ukraine to be substantially different, not just from the Trump administration, but from the Obama administration and previous administrations. In other words, one of trying to use Ukraine as a bludgeon against Russia. That's essentially all I believe it is, from the perspective of the U.S. foreign policymakers. But it will get it. That bludgeon is always there. It can always be picked up. Right now, the Biden administration has more urgent things to deal with, including the rebellion among the governors of the states and COVID and the economy collapsing. These are all much, much more important to Washington than Ukraine is.
Nicolai, you did mention in your article, because of Biden's past connection with Ukraine, and I'm not saying particularly as officially as the Vice President of the United States, but having a prosecutor fired, his son was involved in a company called Burisma. I mean, to what degree does he have to kind of tiptoe around Ukraine? Because as you point out, that his Republican opponents will pounce. That was the word you used. So, I mean, how much does this complicate the Biden administration's dealings with Ukraine?
It adds a layer of reluctance to deal with Ukraine openly, because any sort of perception that the Biden administration is bending over backwards to assist specific interests in Ukraine will be interpreted as a confirmation of Trump's accusations that there's a family involvement. It's essentially the flip argument of what we've been having with respect to Trump. Now, the Republican opposition will doubtless make exactly the same argument with respect to the Biden administration and Biden family personally, with respect to any new initiatives in Ukraine. This, by the way, despite the bipartisan support in Congress for supporting Ukraine. That's sort of politics, but this is personal.
Well, the interesting thing, let me just follow up on that, and I'll go to George. The interesting thing is that, this is kind of the polar opposite of what with Trump, but I would just give a caveat there, is that there was no evidence that Trump had any kind of collusion with Russia. There is ample evidence that the Biden family had deep connections and lucrative connections with Ukraine. Sorry, George.
No,
let me just add one sentence to that. When has evidence ever mattered in these things?
Yeah, but it's also not immediately clear how that family issue plays out, because to the extent that a Biden family did have connections with Ukraine and all these lucrative deals, that was the pre-Zelensky era. So, and if you remember the telephone call between Trump and Zelensky, Zelensky was just quite, actually seemed to be quite critical. I mean, obviously he was sucking up to Trump when he was talking to him, but he was clearly distancing himself from the Bidens, and particularly when he was talking about the ambassador, this Masha Yovanovitch, and so on. So it's not like there is a connection between Biden and Zelensky.
Just to return to that one-off comment that I made, in the interpretation of politics, the perception here is what matters. And it will be the perception dictated by mainstream news outlets, of which there are only two, maybe three in the United States, New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, that sets the agenda of the discourse. Both of you may be right. There may be something there. There may not be anything there. It may be that Zelensky was touting one line and is now touting another. None of that. What will form the framework of the relationship is how this all plays out in the public media. And that's a sad commentary. In other words, we seem to have shrunk the arena of diplomacy, which requires a good deal of trust and avoidance of public scrutiny in order to make all sorts of deals that are only possible with a gentlemanly understanding of what's going to happen as a result of these deals. That space has shrunk to almost zero in the United States, with many other countries, Russia being the prime example. And as a result, no one even wants to engage in discussions anymore for fear that they might go public. And that's a serious problem in promoting international discourse, in having diplomatic relations that function as a mechanism for stability in the world.
And Nicolai, you talked at great length in your article about the condition of the body politic in Ukraine, and the official line from the Ukrainian government, or I call official Kiev, after the forceful change of government. I mean, who is Ukrainian? What is Ukraine? Because in your article you go in great detail about how there's been almost none, if zero, and negative healing in creating a national identity. Because it seems to me the people behind the Maidan and their successors is that they have a nationalism without a nation.
Yes, and I guess I would describe nationalism as an ideology that tries to create a nation.
Yes, yes.
And Mazzini and others in the 19th century specifically referred to this.
Yes.
But the difference being that this project of a Ukraine in the mind of the nationalist, which now has to be created outside of my mind in this territory, is ongoing. Mm. And it is, in addition to being resisted by people who don't necessarily agree with that particular vision that the nationalist has. They may agree with another vision of Ukraine and be perfectly willing, as I believe the vast majority of Russophone Ukrainians are, they simply do think of themselves as very loyal Ukrainians, but having a Russian heritage. And why is that a problem? They don't see it as a problem. But for nationalists, it is de facto a problem. And this then, not only is there popular resistance, but we have to think about the 21st century as being very different from the late 19th century and early 20th century. Namely, that in the time of an internet and international exchange of informations, it is very difficult for a country like Ukraine, which is surrounded on many sides by neighbors, but overwhelmingly by Russian speakers, to separate or to prevent, I should say, its citizens from having access to that cultural fund. In other words, the government can try all it wants to suppress and prevent and shut off connections, but it is so ridiculously easy to get around those. I was looking at a survey yesterday, very interesting study of the usage of resources, internet resources, the most popular internet resources in Ukraine over the past several years, published in Ukrainska Pravda. And it turns out that they're all overwhelmingly Russian, speak in Russian. Even when they are written, when they are published in Ukraine, they are still published in Russian, or actually legally now they have to be in both languages. But given the choice, Ukrainians still prefer to read them in Russian, and that's noted in the article. Also, they do a very interesting breakdown in that survey of how many visits these sites have from, respectively, Russia, the Russian domain area, and Ukraine. And it turns out that very often they're very comparable. In other words, it's not just one audience that these Ukrainian sites are speaking to. They actually have a widespread audience in Russia itself. And again, undermining the official Kiev narrative with respect to how different we are from Russia. This proves that there really are no borders in the internet, and the attempt to create such borders is simply laughable.
But why then attempt to do this? I mean, that's really the question. I mean, why are they attempting to suppress Russian instruction in high schools? Why are they, banning Hungarian instruction for the Hungarian minorities? This goes against even what was thought acceptable after World War I, when national minorities were supposed to be respected and their national culture was supposed to be maintained. So they're going back to a very, very extremist nationalist ideology.
I keep coming back to a quote that a famous British economist who studied the Soviet economy, Philip Hansen, used to say when asked, why would anybody undertake collectivization, because it was so clearly destructive of the economy of the country? And he said, because the people undertaking it were not in their right mind. They were in Marx's mind. Well, here we have the case of people who are in Bandera's mind,
Yes.
I'm afraid. And that's why I keep referring in my writings to nationalism and underscore the point that nationalism is an ideology. In other words, it is a willful restriction of your own point of reference and your own points of view. You see, you see things that are contradictory to your narrative, to your information, and you reject it, or you ignore it, or you seek to remove it from people's view. This ultimately fails. And I think there is an immediate danger for Ukraine, which I see again in simply very clearly defined political science terms. In other words, we understand certain phenomenon from comparative political science, which is the dilemma that the government has is that it is trying to shape society. It is nation building internally. But it is doing things that are unpopular and therefore undermining its political support. Now, as long as the country is a democracy, it has to refer back to the same people that are now upset with it for support to continue those policies. And here we have an irresolvable conundrum, namely, it is theoretically conceivable that the country could succeed in this if it had enough time and applied enough pressure to do that. But by all accounts, that would take more than a generation. So 20 years or more to basically re-educate the current population and turn it into a much more nationalistic version of Ukrainians. But in a democracy, they don't have that time.
Well, wouldn't you even say, because even globalization, going back to the points, you know, the internet has no borders. I mean, you that's just something unless you really want to flip the switch. I mean, and then disappear yourself from the world community. Another issue I think that's really important here. You mentioned that the foreign minister of Ukraine is waiting for the Biden administration so they can rock and roll. I think those are the words you use. But let's put it into a broader context. I mean, one other thing that Ukraine can't do much about is its location. Okay, yeah. Russia is right next door, and you've given just in passing, you've given the strong connections many, if not most, Ukrainians still have with Russia in one form or another. I mean, what's going to happen when they're rock and rolling, and if there is a rock and roll, what does that mean for Russia?
I'm not sure, because I haven't really thought about that, because I don't anticipate that any dramatic improvement, or not improvement, but sort of greater agitation in the agenda of Ukraine and the West and the United States. Not just because there is a certain recurrence of Ukraine fatigue. In other words, the West wanted this and this and this to happen. It's been 7 years. With the best of intentions and willingness to
money.
Yeah, the best of willingness to see progress, there are still so many areas where Ukraine has not done as much as the West expected it to do. And of course, then the question becomes simply as a matter of pragmatic policy, do you put more money into this? Do you invest even more? The Ukrainian attitude, again, is the official Ukrainian attitude, seems to be a very simplistic one. Namely, we're not worried. The West will always come through for us with more money and more support because we are indispensable. We are the indispensable nation for the United States because we're sort of the tip of the spear against Russia. Well, of course, but Poland is the same thing. The Baltics is the same. Why do we need Ukraine? What is, I mean, just as a, if I were sort of sitting in the State Department, I'd say, fine, but you're going to do this anyway, no matter what we give you. What's the leverage that you have to force us to give you what you want? And the answer is none. None.
Well, except that the leverage is you can make life difficult for Russia. So, for instance, you do talk about the possibility of a Blitzkrieg in the East. Well, that's going to make life very difficult for Russia because either the Donbass is defeated, which is a humiliation for Russia, or Russia is pulled in to the war in a very explicit way, something that Russia has, desperately wanted to avoid. So either way, it's good for the United States. So why not? Why wouldn't Victoria Nuland, who will now be number 3 in the State Department, why wouldn't they want to push something like that?
In the broader context of relations, there are, I would assume, still things that the United States and other countries need from Russia. So, as much as it is reassuring to the self-image of the United States to prod and to point and to make fun, essentially, of Russia. And I think the policy of making fun of Russia is really what the Obama administration's policy boiled down to. Remember Obama going on to some comedy talk show at night and saying, Russia doesn't produce anything, Russia doesn't do this. So why are we even worried? We're not worried. So I think there will be a sort of a re-acceptance of that, a renewal of that policy.
Well,
but there's so many pragmatic issues that Russia is needed for, including neither last nor least the issues having to do with global climate change. And ultimately, I think serious people like the incoming Secretary of State Burns, who can be talked to.
You mean
Tony Blinken?
Blinken is the
Oh,
Secretary.
I'm sorry. Who is Burns?
Burns is CIA.
CIA. Yeah, right. CIA. I'm sorry. Then, yeah. Well, at least as a U.S. As an ambassador, he was quite reasonable. So we'll see.
Well, Nicolai, I want to press this issue a little bit because I think George is onto something here. I mean, when you have somebody like Victoria Nuland, and we know her famous conversation with Jeffrey Piot. I mean, and I look at Tony Blinken, and I can't help but feel, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think Joe is going to be an on-hands president. Maybe
right.
proven wrong. But I mean, when I look at Tony Blinken in Syria, and I look at Victoria Nuland on Ukraine, I kind of get this feeling of we got unfinished business here. Okay, I mean, am I wrong? Is that an irrational thing to think?
No. But I do think that there will be pushback against a policy that under the Obama administration's policy ultimately was defined as the cold shoulder to Russia. There will always be voices and increasingly European voices added to this. And I would just point to what's happening with Nord Stream 2 and the resistance that the Germans have surprisingly shown to America's insistence that it stop its commerce with Russia. There will be insistence that Russia is important. It is important to have stable relations. Now, the level of those relations will be the issue of debate. But no reasonable person would argue that we can afford to cut Russia out. And there's one thing I wanted to add to that, which is an important consideration. Senior diplomats and scholars undoubtedly and undoubtedly agree with Henry Kissinger's assessment that one of the stupidest things that America has done in the past 2 decades is to push Russia and China closer together.
Yeah, I was just
to the extent that the United States, let's say we accept at their word that they're less concerned about Russia than they are with China. Either way, you shift your assault from the perspective of the United States, it only results in bringing these two mega powers together, creating, I think, a real danger to America's global hegemony.
But that, I think, as Peter, you have said many times, that train has left the station. Russia is not going to distance itself from China just to get friendly relations with the United States. And Russia just doesn't trust the United States at all.
Absolutely, yeah.
And doesn't expect anything from the Biden administration. I mean, that's
right.
Everything that the Kremlin is saying now. We expect nothing but hostility from the Biden people.
Exactly. And here's another reason why, therefore, the anticipated hostility is probably less worrisome, will be less worrisome than we think it will be, because Russia's prepared.
Yes.
Russia has prepared itself, well, as best it can. Obviously, there will be some casualties, but it's already redirected its foreign policy interests. It has already reduced its financial dependence on the dollar. It's done a lot of things that other nations closely aligned with the United States probably wish they had thought of doing now. And then there's sort of the long-term prospect. Again, if there's, it's a little surprising to me that the global pandemic hasn't brought the world community a little closer together. It really speaks poorly of the human race. But what happens if there's a massive global depression because of the hyperinflation of the dollar? I mean, we are printing money as if it were going out of style. I don't know, and nobody can tell you. I've asked financial experts. Nobody can tell you what the consequences of this will be. But clearly, you want to hedge your bets and diversify as much as possible.
Okay,
and Russia's been doing that for many years now.
Okay, let's just wrap this up here. I mean, we've talked a lot about international relations. What do Ukrainians expect? If you can say, when you look, we all know that there's the differences within Ukraine are. I think the word extreme is appropriate here. I mean, but this still is a nation state, and there was a traumatic, tumultuous event in 2014. But it doesn't look like much has been resolved. Okay, so I mean, what is next for Ukraine? Because it's always, I studied Poland for many, many years. I was a Fulbright scholar there, and and it was, Poland, for so many people, was it for good for Germany, good for Russia, good for Europe, but it was never really much about the Poles. So can you kind of speak a little bit about Ukrainians?
Most Ukrainians, I think, would be happy if their personal environment could be made less tense. And much of their upset with the government and with their circumstances, their living circumstances, can be put at the door of the government, because the government often makes decisions that seem to be directed at enhancing social discomfort and confrontation among various groups.
Like the
language laws. Oh. Yeah. There's also the increase in tariffs, which could have been done much more sensibly. And they have a lot of good advisors in the government who could be listened to, and people who are advising that maybe making your budget dependent on IMF handouts is not the wisest way to go. I mean, there's a lot of good advice there. The problem is with the political class, the political elite, and the vested interests of very rich people, oligarchs in Ukraine, in the current status quo, because it creates chaos. It creates a weak state. And in conditions of a weak state, they can certainly extract a great deal of profit from themselves. Even people who are on U.S. sanctions lists, like Kolomoisky and others, Firtash, they can get around all of this and somehow transfer millions of dollars into their own pockets, into offshore accounts, regardless of all this, because of the chaos within the state, which they have essentially again, to use a political science term, captured. So, and there we have the problem. Nevertheless, Ukrainians are an inherently optimistic people, and they want to believe that the best is still yet to come.
In the case of Ukraine, I think that considering its history, yes, the best must be
yeah, it must be just around the corner. Must be just around the corner. But they are extremely skeptical of anybody promising that to them. And the election of Zelensky was very telling, because it was an election of a person who obviously did not have those ties, who was the furthest thing from a politician, mocking. His career was made mocking the political system of Ukraine. And they expected that someone like that would actually be able to come in and more or less do the same thing, flip his nose at the powers that be in the West, etc., like the person that he played on his show did. That's exactly what he did. And people wanted that, but that's not really a policy.
George, you want to close it out?
Yeah, that's you kind of wonder really whether in the end, and this is the question that was asked really from the beginning, was that can this country really be kept together? Because it was all put together in a very haphazard way. The Bolsheviks took part of the East, something that hadn't been part of historic Ukraine, added it. Then Stalin made a variety of additions. And you then have to look, can this country really be kept together?
Right. But let me just have one quick thought. Namely, that process of picking and putting together has been going on for more than 100 years, 150 years. And it could continue for another 150 years, bits and pieces coming together. So in terms of the life that the average Ukrainian has to expect, they live within those large historical timeframes and have to deal with what they're dealing with, in their lifespan. So it'll probably it'll no doubt still be there as a country, but exactly how and in what shape will always be a question, I guess.
Yep, and I've always said, Ukraine isn't going east, it isn't going west, it's going to stay exactly where it is. Okay, Nicolai Petro, thank you very much for joining us here on The Gaggle. Thanks, George. As events develop, we will have a Biden administration in the matter of hours now, and we'll be keeping a very close eye on what the administration will do vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. If you like this, please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll have a lot more for you soon.